Well, thank you very much. I do represent the University of East London, but I'm going to confess I'm an American. But it's very good to be here, and very much enjoyed the sessions this morning and look forward to the other sessions. I'm going to be really focusing on business education. Business education in particular is been a focal point within universities. We've seen a lot of changes. We've seen a lot of questioning about what we do in business schools, much more so than I think other disciplines, particularly given recent events. The global financial crisis in particular has really called into questions many things about business education in a way that we had not previously thought about. We see a lot more emphasis on the need to have not just socially responsible business leaders, we need to have ethical business leaders, and we also need to have business leaders who can change and be comfortable with change in this rapidly changing world that we live in. And I think that how we think about education, particularly business education, then is very important. And we've seen, in particular, our kind of bread and butter areas really come under scrutiny. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, in particular with in terms of the MBA, which is, of course, a very important part of what business schools do. So what we're seeing, though, is this kind of rapid changing that has really created a lot more complexities and a lot more uncertainty for business leaders. And anyone in a company today can tell you that it's much more complex. Whether or not we consider ourselves a global university, a local university, whether or not a firm considers itself an international firm, a local firm, we're all interconnected now in this global market. So leaders have to develop then these kind of new skills and capabilities to really manage this rapid change that not only has a monetary impact, but it affects our time and it also affects our potential. We find ourselves pulled now in many directions that we were not previously. And this makes it much more difficult in terms of figuring out what our priorities are, what we need to be doing. And one of the things that we have to really be cognizant of in terms of business schools and business education then is how are we working with employers, how are we working with the labor market to make sure that we're creating the kind of employees they need. And that does mean then also thinking about lifetime learning, because we can no longer give our students enough facts, enough theories. So we need to really focus then much more on those kind of critical thinking skills that they're going to need and create that kind of flexibility and adaptability to learning that will make them sustainable in the labor market. Now, there are really 5 areas when we think about the changes, the major causes of changes that we're seeing, and particularly when we're reflecting on business and business education. And of course, digitalization, the whole idea of how we do business. It's amazing to just think of myself in my own life and think about how cell phones, communication technology has really revolutionized everything that we do. First we started out communicating on the phone, texting on the phone, now we do emails on the phone. Now everyone needs to have a tablet, and it's also added to a lot more pressures on business people in terms of how they work, the kinds of work they do. So we need to really also think about a more holistic approach of how we think about business students and how we prepare them then for that business sector that they go into. There's also been, what I'd call the commoditization of particularly products. We think a lot, we talk a lot with students in business schools about brands, about making your product distinct, and it's an ever-increasing challenge as we produce more and more is put out to the market. Things that were exclusive brands at one point now are mass-produced. So there's really that commoditization that's happened within thinking about goods, economic activity, and the kind of value that we get. As mentioned previously today, we also see those economic shifts We see, major shifts in terms of GDP density, those movements much more over to Asia, where the kind of centers of economic activity are, and that really has to have an impact on how we teach, what we teach, and who we're teaching. We see a lot more globalization in terms of movements of students, and a truly globalized business school is one that really has students from all over the world. And that is really in response to those kind of population changes. So the economic activity is also very much attached to where population movements are, where, we see places like the Middle East, we see China, where they really have not just large populations, but what we call a youth bulge, where you have a majority of the population, for example, in the Middle East today, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. So what does that mean in the future in terms of what kind of jobs, what kind of labor force, how all these people will need trained, they will need educated, and they will need to be productive in the world that they're in. So these kind of economic shifts then are paramount in terms of our thinking, how we look at what we do, and who we serve. And again, that all ties back into kind of globalization. And, of course, globalization often is a catchword for many things. But in terms of the kind of business realities, it's really that interdependence, that integration of the world economy. And we see it, again, if we look at the global financial crisis, we see that really started in the United States, spilled over, of course, to Europe, and then trickled on into the rest of the world. And so that idea somehow that we can separate ourselves or think of ourselves in any contained way now has really dissipated. And so we're very much connected, and so we have to think about how we educate our students in terms of thinking about that kind of global environment. And then, of course, the socialization that comes with that. The whole idea now that we are more connected, that more so than any other time in anyone's life in this room, they are coming into contact with people from all over the world continually. That very few of us can really live in any kind of localized environment. And particularly when if we're talking about businesses, even if I have a small corner store in a small village in England, I am going to be coming into contact through my merchandise that I purchase, the way that I do business, the people that come into my shop from all over the world. And so we really need to build in then internationalization, that kind of way in which we approach our curriculum has to be embedded then. It can no longer be seen as a bolt-on. In fact, in some ways, I think using the term, we have a degree in international business studies is cliche, because business studies itself is international. So thinking about this, and thinking about the world we live in, and thinking about how it really impacts business education, we see then that each of these factors have really put a significant amount of pressure on what we do in business schools. And what we have to be careful of, and there's always that tendency of trying to stick more and more into the curriculum, okay? And getting it essentially overloaded. So we have to really then focus on what are the major areas, what are the major areas and the major kind of shortfalls that we see as we move forward. And having reviewed the literature and looked at various studies and talked with a number of deans, business people, there are really 4 key areas that I like to identify in terms of thinking about those shortfalls. And there was a real good study done by Harvard University that also identified these areas. And the first one, of course, is looking at leadership, globalization, communication, kind of presentation skills. And one of the things that comes back continually from employers, from businesses, is the need for students to be able to communicate, and be able to communicate in a variety of settings. And then also identifying problems and working with ambiguous situations. Now, As I said, a lot of this centers on the MBA. There's been a zillion articles in the last year or two about MBAs. Are they in decline? How should we fix our MBA? How should we not fix our AA? Should we junk our MBA? In fact, this week in the Financial Times, there was an article saying, advising business schools to start from scratch, burn the old MBA, come back with something brand new. A lot of this is because there are a lot of pressures now, and you know, there really has been what I would call the commoditization, just like I said about products, we see it with the MBA, where there's become a kind of vanilla MBA, and it's not seen as serving businesses in the way that it should. So consequently then, it's created a lot of debate. There's declining numbers. Most schools are concerned, except of course you have your top schools, your top MBA recruiting schools, but any school after that has become very concerned. The other thing is we have had some very lean times, particularly in places like the United States, in Europe with the global financial crisis. A lot of employers want more specialized labor coming in. The MBA, a general MBA, does not give the employee the kind of specialized skills that they'd like. And then they have to do more training. Training costs money. And so there's been an emphasis on moving away. And in fact, many universities, as they've seen their numbers decline in MBAs, they've seen specialized masters increase in numbers. And so it calls into question who and what is the MBA serving. And the other thing is that many MBAs have been criticized for being over-analytical and not focusing enough on those really crucial intercultural skills, communication skills, as I mentioned, and those problem-solving skills, but doing it in a very quantitative way that doesn't necessarily lend to building that whole person that we need, and that person that can deal with complexities, who can really go out there into a global world and be flexible and adjust themselves to the needs. So in terms of thinking about these kind of key areas then, and also in terms of what we need then to focus on, leadership has emerged as a very important question. The whole idea that we don't need just managers, that what we need to be developing in business schools are essentially leaders. A lot of that comes from the idea and the notion that the primary importance of really a job, a management job, is no longer about top-down command and control, telling those subordinates under you what to do. Managers, in many organizations now, we see a leveling of the playing field, people being much more in a flat organization structure. And all the literature comes back and tells us that that is a very good way to operate in terms of getting synergy, in terms of getting ideas. Strategy often comes out of doing, and it comes out of doing with different people at different levels. So the kind of bringing in those other voices. So to do that, then, we need to be really grooming and growing people who can think in a way of influencing, not just managing. And to have those kind of big picture views, to think strategically. And so to do that is a big challenge for business schools, because those skills are hard to teach in the classroom. You know, teaching someone how to manage, how to organize themselves, how to keep track of the books, those things we've always been good at. But really going out and trying to cultivate leadership is something then that really takes us beyond the classroom. And that's why what we see is that many organizations, many business schools are now employing coaching. We're having much more of a merger with the social sciences, psychology, coming in and playing a much bigger role in what we're doing to really kind of customize and meet those challenges. Also creating opportunities for students that enhance their experience through experiential learning, by having them participate in activities that really challenge themselves and who they are. The other area that's very important in terms of thinking about business education and the future of business education, of course, is globalization. And one of the real challenges there is understanding what is culture and what are kind of universal practices or behaviors that are accepted throughout. And this is something then that business schools have not always done very well. And I know, particularly being in the UK, it's been a challenge because often, in business schools, we have focused very much on the task of teaching business courses and not so much teaching courses that we would see as much more, intercultural. So getting those kind of cross-cultural competencies and adjusting what we teach to also who we teach. One of the things about globalization is that our classrooms are very multicultural. I work in an institution where we have 120 different nationalities learning in our institution. We have a very diverse staff. So adjusting our coursework and thinking about what textbook we use, how we teach, and not assuming too much about our classroom audience has become much more important in what we do. We need to think about, who our students are, where they're coming from, and where they'll go back to practice business, because that makes it relevant for them. Teaching students about MNCs when they're going back to a country where the majority of people will work in SMEs is not necessarily good value for their time, for their money spent in the universities. So the other thing is we need to figure out how to develop programs that go beyond just semester exchanges. One of the things that we've seen at my university is often students who go study abroad don't really integrate into society. That they go there and they often have an experience, it's often around the culture of the university that they're at, much more than the culture that they're in. So how do we create experiences? How do we get our students outside of the classroom? How do we make sure when they go abroad that they're not just hanging out with a group of British students in a foreign country, And we all have seen this, we often call it kind of the expat syndrome, expatriates often tend to cling together. And so how do we get our students beyond that so that we make these, so that it's just not talk, that these abroad experiences are real and real for the students. So the challenge is, how to teach our students and really create managers then that can fit into this globalized world and who understand that globalized world, who have the kind of empathy that they need, who have the kind of cross-cultural skills that they need to really be successful. And that's really what it takes. So that brings me to the whole idea of communication and presentations, which we need to focus much more on. I often say to my students, what I want you to get out of this experience is really to gain your voice. And how do we do that? How do we get these kind of future leaders to really be much more introspective and reflective? And employers, when surveyed, often say they want self-aware employees. They want people who are perceptive, who can be in a situation and adjust themselves to the environment they're in. And to do that, you have to understand oneself. So again, going beyond the kind of traditional kind of textbook learning and thinking about what kind of programs we can integrate into what we do to make sure that our students come out with that self-awareness of understanding of who they are so they can understand who others are. They need to be trained then in understanding not only recognizing cross-cultural issues, but really how they communicate those issues. How do they really how do they write? How do I write my emails? How do I, and of course English speakers in particular, and I know from myself, is that we often take for granted if someone speaks English, they understand us, they understand our culture, they understand our humor, okay? Which of course is not the same, okay? Speaking the language and speaking the culture are often different. I can tell you my own experience going to the UK and working in a British institution that I often find we share a lot of words with different meanings. So, if that is between two countries that are English speaking, let's take it one step further, and we go into other cultures. So we need to make sure that our students are aware of that. So we need to build that into our curriculum. We don't need to just teach them how to write a good sentence, but to write a good sentence that can be cross-cultural, to speak in a way that can be understood and appreciated in various contexts. And this is really essential in terms of business leaders, people who are going to be successful in this world, in this globalized world. And this is why also, having that ability of this really kind of integrated classroom where you have people from different cultures. And again, one of the things I often say to students is, the best team, when you're forming a team and you're working on a project in your business courses, is to really team up with people from different backgrounds. Because this insight and being able to work on these projects are going to be a great precursor to when you go out to work in the world, the business world of today. The other problem that's been identified by a lot of employers and recruiters as well is in working in this kind of ambiguous environment and dealing with this complexity is that we need to make sure that our students have the ability to kind of frame the problems and really understand how to take that important first step in terms of progressing into the world and combining all this information overload with information scarcity. And, of course, we've got Google at our fingerprint. We just tap in. I'm sure many of you are sitting there with your iPhones now and can access lots and lots of information. But it's really being able to, know what you're looking for in that information, go through that information, and often, work with information that sometimes you've got too much information, sometimes it's scarce, but trying to make sense of it all. So today's students have to be a problem solver. And more so than that, they have to be able to identify it, okay? So students have to be really comfortable with the complexity and change. And that requires us being very comfortable with complexity and change and teaching in a way which is often very difficult, particularly for, I think, academics, because we're often very trained, very narrowly. We feel very comfortable with our subject matter, our subject in terms of the narrow niche that we have. We can speak for hours, speak for days, speak for weeks on that subject, but we're not really good with ambiguous information. We don't necessarily like complexity, and we definitely don't like to go interdisciplinary. But these are the very skills that our business leaders need. They need to feel comfortable in lots of different contexts, using lots of different information, and they need to be able to use it in a very clever way. So one of the things that many business schools are doing, and my business school included, and that is really bringing in that kind of real-world interaction, working much more in real time on real projects, integrating the business world and really getting it in sync with what we're doing in business education. And I think it's not just about, employability, but it's really about providing the kind of education that 21st century young adults need. And that has to be really integrated with the real world. And case studies as well are very important. That business simulations, but again, making those real. I was just recently working with a university in China on developing case studies in Chinese, that for the Chinese market. Because again, it can be very frustrating in a lot of these locations where you end up using, Harvard case studies, which are excellent, but are not necessarily written in a way that fits in to the environment and the context in which you're teaching in. And so being able to take that information and adjust those and as much as globalize them, also be able to localize them. And those are the kind of skills then that are really valuable for us as academics and also for our students. Some other things to consider: programs need to be flexible and customized, and as said before, distance learning, how people learn today, when they learn. And, you know, as Paul said, and I really echo this, you know, lots of the studies, lots of the research shows, particularly adult learners, learn best by doing. And much less by what they necessarily are being taught in a lecture, in a seminar. And so we need to have that kind of flexibility. We need to be able to feel comfortable customizing our curriculum to who our students are and how they learn. The other thing is, you know, again, if we want to be a truly internationalized curriculum, an international school, we have international students, we need then to make sure that we can really separate out from our kind of national ethos, as it were, in terms of the kind of curriculum that we develop. And thinking about, you know, who our students are, where they come from, and making sure that we're building in that kind of information. I know I've taught on the MBA at my university, and we have a lot of students from India, and it's very important, you know, to really contextualize it for them as well as globalize it for them, and to make sure then that we get that kind of interchange. The other thing is, time is much more important. We are in a very fast-paced world, and we need to make sure that in terms of the application of the market and how students study can be done in the time frame that they need. And this is why developing shorter courses, you know, being able to have kind of executive education